This panel is Rethinking Pedagogical Practice in the Contemporary Cultural Moment. And our first speaker is Ivan Phillips, Dr. Ivan Phillips, I do apologise. So I'll just read out who you are. So Dr. Ivan Phillips is Associate Dean, Learning and Teaching in the School of Creative Arts at the University of Hertfordshire. He has experience of teaching undergraduate and postgraduate students on practice-based courses, specialising in animation, games art, VFX, SFX, model making, character creation, interactive media and screen cultures. Wow. Ivan is the author of Once Upon a Time Lord, The Myths and Stories of Doctor Who, and has published widely on popular culture, art and literature, with a particular interest in science fiction and the Gothic. So Ivan, over to you.
Thanks, Stella. I almost recognise myself from the description. Okay, so hopefully, can you see that, everyone?
Yep, all good.
Fantastic. Okay, and thanks to my students for the nice image on this front screen. The doll is mine, the skeleton is not mine, nor is its jacket, but it's my classroom, or one of them. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit, and hopefully this should follow on really quite nicely. I should probably cut my email out, shouldn't I? Just as a thought. Didn't realise I had it on. Apologies. There we go. I'll try again. Because hopefully this will follow on quite nicely from the discussion before the break. I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, really some of my own reflections on content warnings and trigger warnings and my use of them, which is quite belated, I have to say. So it's been interesting hearing some of the discussions. And I think in some ways, this is a disclaimer, in some ways, this is what a colleague of mine likes to refer to as a start point inquiry, or it may well just be a slightly elongated way of stating the bleeding obvious. But I hope some of the things I raise kind of chime with what people have been discussing and maybe raise some useful discussion. I've got hanging over this presentation just a quote. It's actually the last line from a piece that Jack Halberstam wrote in 2017. And it ends with, can we still dare to be surprised, shocked, thrilled into new forms of knowing? Now, actually, I mean, it's a lovely way to end the paper, the piece that he wrote. But actually, the piece is quite a savage attack on the use of trigger warnings. And actually, I disagree with pretty much every aspect of the piece that Halberstam wrote. It almost can be summarized as a kind of statement of let them toughen themselves up a little bit. It can't do them any harm. So, but I do think that question is worth bearing in mind, because it's kind of in the back of my own head when I prepare a lot of teaching sessions. You know, the power to shock and the importance of that, and how much we can retain it when we want to be compassionate to the diversity of the students in our classrooms. So now actually a little bit of context, I suppose. The origins of this particular paper and some of the questions I'm pondering in it comes from the point whatever of me that is associate dean rather than a classroom teacher. And I got forwarded actually a year ago, pretty much exactly, a letter from one of the legal teams in the university. And this was from an unnamed arts correspondent from the Mail on Sunday who was wanting me to answer some questions. And I've just put a few little quotes from the letter. This correspondent wanted to request the following information under the Freedom of Information Act and the Environmental Information Regulations. They were asking about the use of trigger warnings. And this was based on the potential for certain materials to cause stress, discomfort and or offence to students. And that seemed inoffensive enough, I suppose. It was kind of in the air at the time. And actually, it was only one of the courses they were asking about was one of ours. Interestingly, fine art, which is one of the few I haven't actually taught on. But they were asking whether we were using trigger warnings as a matter of course within that programme. The answer actually is no, weren't at the time, and I'm not aware that we are at the moment. But towards the end of the letter, the correspondent then asked, have any of the degree courses felt the need to rest and or drop particular teaching materials and or remove material from those teaching materials? And this is the bit that really got my hackle prickling a little bit. It was this kind of conflation of discussion of content warnings and trigger warnings with the ideas about you know, and I'm reading between the lines because this is the Mail on Sunday. This was a sort of right-wing agenda, I suspect, around freedom of speech, so-called, and around, you know, you can't teach Dickens, you can't even teach Jane Austen, you know, got to give trigger warnings for 1984 and so on. So I responded to this letter, but I was made slightly uneasy by it because I got the feeling it kind of tied into a lot of the stuff in the news at the time. And I won't read any of these out, but you can kind of see, and it's from across the spectrum. You know, there's Mail Online, there's LBC, but there's also a piece in The Guardian. Trigger warnings on classic literature are one small step from book banning, which is Cobblers. The Times, universities blacklist harmful literature, and on it goes. Universities say even a trigger warning is triggering, it's hard not to pity the students. And then this very, I think, notorious piece that was published in The Atlantic a few years ago by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, which was called The Coddling of the American Mind. I recommend reading it for a sort of example of, yeah, the kind of slightly rabid and willfully obfuscating approaches to trying to actually take care of student well-being and health in the classroom when we're teaching some quite challenging material and trying to get our students discussing some quite deeply felt and important topics. And of course, you know, I'm based in the UK, and I'm familiar with these kinds of culture wars, if we want to call them that. So around the time I put in the proposal for this paper, we were going through one of our Tory leadership elections of last year, the first one. So these were the main four candidates, all of whom decided to start using war on woke as part of their sort of, weaponized anti-liberalism. There was a piece by Andrea Jenkins, who was for a couple of days, I think, one of the education secretaries or undersecretaries, I think, talking about students being fed a diet of critical race theory, anti-British history and sociological Marxism. So I hope I don't disappoint in that respect this afternoon. I'll do my best. What was quite striking to me is it's not just the usual suspects. Actually, some people who I have a lot of respect for started to pitch into this discussion. So this is going back a few years now, as you can see, but Barack Obama back in 2015 was talking about college campuses where they don't want to have a guest speaker who's too conservative, or they don't want to read a book if it has language that's offensive to African Americans, and so on and so forth. And he says, I've got to tell you, I don't agree with that either. I don't agree that you, when you become students at colleges, have to be coddled and protected from different points of view. So that's Barack Obama. Stephen Fry, who says a lot of very, very intelligent and sensible and sharp things, but also sometimes says the most astonishingly insensitive and crass things. And this is one of the latter cases where he talks about the word rape now being considered a rape. If you say you can't watch this play, you can't watch Titus Andronicus, or you can't read it in a Shakespeare class, or you can't read Macbeth because it's got children being killed in it, it might trigger something when you were young that upset you once because uncle touched you in a nasty place. Well, I'm sorry, just grow up. Astonishing, really, not just because of what he's actually saying, but because it's again a willful misunderstanding of the issues, because I'm not aware of anyone who advocates the use of content or trigger warnings in classrooms actually saying you shouldn't teach Titus Andronicus or read Macbeth and so on. So just as a little bit of a sidestep, a sort of digression in some ways, which is dangerous when you've only got 15 minutes, but in Lukianoff and Haidt, they talk about students who are given a choice through use of trigger warnings to avoid the material that's taught. Now you can look through a million different pieces of research, some of which says, yes, trigger warnings are a good thing, some are a bad thing. There are some quite interesting pieces that say they're actually counterproductive. I'm not going to go into that today, but there was one piece I came across which showed some a study which was done at 4 American universities in 2021. 355 undergraduate students, 87% of them identified with one of 17 listed traumas as life events, and this was from a checklist, which is quite a standard checklist. 12.3% of them scored significant in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They were given 2 passages from Toni Morrison's novel from 1970, The Bluest Eye, which were scenes featuring physical and sexual assault. They were given the choice to swap out those passages to read alternative passages which didn't include the material which was physical and sexual assault. 96% of those students opted to actually read the triggering passage following the trigger warning. So it's only one piece of research, but that's a pretty high percentage of those students who didn't, as Lukianov and Haidt would put it, choose to avoid the difficult material. So my problem is this. I teach, and I teach through choice. I mean, interestingly, I suppose, I don't teach any classes or any modules which are explicitly horror-based. I teach aspects of different modules which include bits of the Gothic, bits of horror, bits of sort of horrific sci-fi and so on. And I try and attune that to my students. So I teach a lot of model design students, and many of them have, I'm going to just flick to the next slide just because Kurt Barlow might be putting people off slightly, which is his modus operandi, really. So I don't teach a class that says explicitly this is about horror. So it's perhaps surprising, it's only in the last couple of years I've even thought about giving kind of formal content warnings. I can't assume expectations from my students for horror. I can't assume their preparedness for shock or disturbance. They haven't signed up. I used to teach an elective called Gods and Monsters, which was kind of horror-ish, but also a bit myth-based. But my students might be, into architectural modeling and not have any interest at all in horror. So I need to be mindful of that. But my biggest problem is my fascination in the Gothic, in horror, comes from some intricately and intimately felt shock moments in my life. Barlow, again, quite importantly, as a 10-year-old, I remember watching Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot series on a caravan park in Bude in Cornwall, and was terrified, but also fascinated. And, it's never left me, and I never want it to. But it did disturb me, it did frighten me. I couldn't sleep well for weeks, and I probably was watching it too young. The thing is, the shock and the unsettlement is fine. I don't, it's not been a problem for me. My other problem on the other side of this is I quite like, maybe it's part of the performative aspect of teaching, I quite like to get a response from classes, if that's a shocked response or whatever. But I don't want my problem to be my students' problem. I'm quite keen to shock and unsettle and get a response. But, and that's a pedagogic act of faith almost, but I'm getting to the stage now where I feel it can't be an act of faith. It has to be more considered than that, because I'm certainly not out to harm my students. And I'm aware, as a white, middle-aged, cisgendered, heterosexual male, also middle class these days, although it wasn't always the case, I'm aware that there's probably no truly safe classroom space, because conditions of power and privilege operate within those spaces automatically. And the minute I step in the room, I'm aware of that. I want my classes to be provocative, but I want them also in some ways to be uncomfortable at times, but I also want them to be compassionate. And I don't want my students to be harmed by anything that I do. So the case that kind of comes to mind when I think about this is I've always enjoyed showing and Shanandaloo, Bunwell and Dali's 1929 film, which contains a very famous scene quite early on in which something happens to an eyeball. Now, interestingly, I wanted to embed it into my video, but YouTube is telling us that that's not a thing that I should be doing. So I will put the a link into the chat later if people want to look at it themselves, although I'm assuming most people probably have come across it. Slight digression, and this is also interesting. Because I'm old-ish and come from a time before internet, I actually was exposed to Bunwell and Dali's eye-slitting scene by a side door through the music of the Pixies back in the late 1980s, although I didn't realize it at the time because I used to because I couldn't look up lyrics online either. So I used to interpret the line slicing up eyeballs as stars in her eyeballs, and I used to interpret the line and Shanandaloo as I can't remember now, but it wasn't that. I didn't know it was anything to do with the film, and but I heard that song long before I was able to go online and actually watch the film, because nobody showed the film to me. It wasn't easily seen. Anyway, this is the scene that I'm talking about, which I'm sure people are well aware of. Now, I've taken great delight over the years in showing that to students and seeing rooms of students almost 100 years from the film being made, still showing an act of a response of revulsion when that scene is shown. in recent years, I've started giving content warnings. And when I first did it, I was a bit cack-handed, and I basically described the scene and said, this shows a scene of an eye being slit. And everyone, when that came up, some of them went, I don't want to see, and others went, oh, right, okay, eye being slit. And it lost its power. Now, I know that's partly about the nature of the content warning I gave and how carefully we can control those. And there is a difference between warning about general disturbing material and specific scenes of shock. But it has raised a set of questions for me. And see, I'm raising my questions just before I have to stop talking. So if we're providing content and trigger warnings, do these diminish the effect or impact of the material? If the effect or impact is intended to be surprising, startling, shocking, even horrific, and we are talking about horror films often here, does this matter? It brings up questions of what I as a teacher think art is for in broad terms, because I teach film, I teach 2D art and so on. What do I think horror is for? What do I think education is for? What, if anything, is the role of discomfort in these, and what about shock? So these are just three of the scenes from my own sort of childhood and teen years which have become ingrained, and they're all shock moments. And they're in my head constantly, but in good ways. Now, as part of this, and partly also as an associate dean, because I think I might need to give guidance to colleagues, I've been trailing around looking at different bits of guidance from various HE institutions about content warnings. And I came across this from the College of Literature, Science and Arts at the University of Michigan. This is a list of the most common, it says, content or trigger warning needs. And if you look through it, it's not everything, but a large chunk of this is the kind of stuff you might regularly find in horror films throughout the history of horror films, from basic stuff like violence to death and so on, but also things like self-harm, suicide, themes of paedophilia, incest, and so on. Now, in a way, I can look at someone like Fred Botting writing about the Gothic, and I won't read this out in full, but this is a pretty good description of both the Gothic genre in the late 1700s, but also of the kind of stuff which is in horror films and horror fiction generally, but also the kind of stuff which may be considered triggering: fear, anxiety, terror, horror, melancholy, reason overwhelmed by feeling and passion signaled as a horrified, paralyzing encounter with something unspeakable, an obscure presence too great to comprehend, evoking an excess of feeling, and so on. So, looking at the research, I've been interested in people like Lorraine Casey Young, who's talking about the paradox of horror, why that people watch and read horror narratives despite the fact that they induce intense, negative and painful emotions that we typically avoid. Things like fear, anxiety, disgust, despair, sadness and hopelessness. Very much the things that Botting was describing in Gothic culture. And Young talks about people like, raises discussions by people like Aaron Smuts about hedonic accounts of horror, that it's actually enjoyable. We like being frightened. Susan Fagan, the paradox of tragedy, whereby the audience is reminded of its common humanity in that it shares and cares for the victims and deplores evil. Maybe argue that's a slightly simplistic view of what horror does, but different lecture. I'm interested in Foucault's notion of the ethic of discomfort and how this has been turned into notions of a pedagogy of discomfort. Foucault wrote about never to consent to being completely comfortable with one's own presuppositions, never to let them fall peacefully asleep, but also never to believe that a new fact will suffice to overturn them. And if we look at people such as Shona Fellman, who's written that if teaching does not hit upon some sort of crisis, if it does not encounter either the vulnerability or the explosiveness of a explicit or implicit critical and unpredictable dimension, it has perhaps not truly taught. And a fascinating article I've been reading recently by Michelinos Zembillas, when people expect comfort, the possibilities of growth may be actually foreclosed. Discomfort, Zembillas goes on, is not only inevitable, but also ethical under certain conditions. Discomfort entails a particular ethic and a turbulent ground on which to critique deeply held assumptions about ourselves and others. This, I think, is what comes to the heart of what I think I'm about as a teacher, whatever material I'm using, that I'm actually about trying to get my students to think about themselves, their own prior experience, their own route to the classroom. And I want them to be able to do that in a way which feels safe to them, but not too safe, not so comforting that they never are given a chance to actually interrogate their own assumptions. Now, the thing that bothers me is, I think the conversation has got so tangled because half the time the people who are arguing against content warnings are misunderstanding them willfully, I think I've said already. but they're actually arguing for some of the same things. So Lukyanov and Haidt talk about a Socratic method. When they're opposing what they call the vindictive protectiveness of trigger warnings and bemoaning the extraordinary fragility of the collegiate psyche, they then go on to say that they want to promote a way of teaching that fosters critical thinking, encouraging students to question their own unexamined beliefs, leads to discomfort, even to anger on the way to understanding. This is not, as far as I can see, very far from the guidance in the University of Michigan guidance on content and trigger warnings, where they say that these are not intended to censure instructors nor invite students to avoid material that challenges them. On the contrary, warning students of challenging material can help their engagement by giving them the ability to take charge of their own health and learning. So, bringing me to my inconclusive conclusion, Spencer and Kolbaga talk about trigger warnings as tools of world making, which I think is a fantastic phrase. I'm going to keep in my head while I think more about this. Like all tools, they should be used with care and discrimination, but rather than limiting speech, trigger warnings actually expand academic speech by engaging students more fully in their own learning. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. We have Dr. Karrȧ Shimabukuro's research focusing on what horrifies us and why, building on their experience with the devil in pre- and early modern English literature to analyse how we create bogeymen, what their function is, and how they are a reflection of our historical and cultural moment. They are currently co-editing a collection, The Horror That Haunts Us, Nostalgia, Revisionism and Trauma in Contemporary American Horror, and other recent work includes a chapter titled Priests, Secrets and Holy Water. All I ever learned about Catholicism, I learned from horror films, in Theology and Horror, Explorations of the Dark Religious Imagination. And there's other work in An Analysis of the Devil in the Culture Wars, in The Last Temptation of Christ and the Passion of the Christ, in The Bible on Screen, in the New Millennium. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Stella. It's a real pleasure to be here. I wanted to first, because I am in the US, I wanted to first sort of preface what my teaching and learning conditions were, because I think they're a little bit different than everybody here. I teach at Elizabeth City State University, which is a historically Black college and university. It's also considered a small liberal arts college of roughly 2,000 students, and I'm in rural Eastern North Carolina in the United States. Our composition classes follow a general pattern. Students take them in their first year or two of their general education classes, and for the most part, we don't have a required syllabus or readings, but we focus on skills. So research, writing, how to take a stance, write a thesis, using sources. I'm the only one in the English department who themes my classes. In the past, I've done composition courses themed around zombies, fairy tales, monsters, and I found it's helpful in both the general education classes, and I do it in my upper level classes, because then the students have a lens that they know they're viewing all the readings through. And so it really helps them with concepts they may find challenging. Our class sizes are anywhere from 25 to 35 students. We have a population that's been very highly impacted by COVID in relation to sort of the rest of our state and region. Most of our students work full-time jobs. Some of them live at home, especially after the last couple of years with COVID, and many of them, because we're in a rural area, commute an hour or more to school. Because we're an HBCU, 71% of our students are Black, but only 54% of our students are traditional college age, so that impacts our classes as well. So in the spring of 2022, I was assigned to teach a Composition 1, and because it was in the spring, I knew it would mostly be students who were repeating or were late taking it. So I thought it would be cool to build a high interest class that centered around the recent Candyman, what turned out to be a sequel, but at that point, a lot of people thought was sort of a remake or a reboot. I also thought it would be interesting to be able to teach a class that connected to their experiences, give them a chance to talk about current events. And my assumption was that they would have at least heard of Candyman, if not seen it. And so I thought I'd be starting off with familiar territory. So we started class talking about horror tropes and different elements that are in horror. And then I designed the modules that we did in class to build on each other. So we have a 16-week semester. So I did 4 modules, each one of 4 weeks, and each roughly focused on a genre. And then the last week of the class, we did grade conferencing where they presented their papers. So for our first module, to introduce them to it, I always like to show thriller because it's a great way to sort of introduce them to a lot of general skills. So observing, taking notes, noting details, we track colors, that sort of thing. And for this module, what they were producing at the end was an infographic. So statistics and body counts and that kind of thing from their choice. It also introduced them to just finding basic information, right? How to research for more informal sources and use websites and podcasts, and to have a discussion about how format, layout, and design impacts how your information is received. When we went over tropes, I made this stunning piece of art that now hangs in my office. I am known for my stick figures in class, so the students always find that fun. One of the things that was interesting with this was the chance to sort of teach against. Our students have been taught to use Canvas for presentations, which is an awful piece of garbage because it's all about flash and substance and flash and design and prettiness, and doesn't really allow you to have any information. And so that was a great conversation to have in class about how you need to make sure your information is accessible, which was something a lot of them had not thought about. And at the end of the week for the workshop, they sit down and grade conference with me and reflect on it. So the idea was that the second module would build on those concepts that we first introduced. We talked about how to take notes as they watched movies because they would then need those details. The next thing we did is we identified topics and themes from the movie that we talked about specific examples, and they created posters actually in class that provided examples of different themes. We also looked at sample movie reviews because that was the assessment they were doing at the end. We identified elements of movie reviews and they chose one to use as a model. They get to choose, so they could either choose one of the 2 films we watched in class or they could choose their own. Most of them were very uncomfortable giving their opinion or taking a stance on something. And part of that is a US consequence of Common Core, where students have been taught pretty much the last 20 years to summarize a text, but not take a stance or have an opinion. And so that's, again, something that I sort of purposely lesson plan against. This is also where I get to introduce them to IMDb as a source, which I love. We wrote them as movie reviews that would be posted online. So we learned about how to hyperlink citations. The idea with module 3 was to build on something that struck them in the review, right? So if they were interested with how current events were shown, or interested in geography or setting, that would then be the thing that they analyzed in their paper. In this module, I also showed them horror noir to give them sort of a model for what that kind of analysis and the types of things they could look at look like. We covered one scholarly article that I specifically chose because it covered a bunch of different topics that they could then use as secondary sources. We used Art of the Title to practice analyzing the opening credits of Candyman, and then gave them a couple of more informal analysis articles. They did struggle with the scholarly analysis, and I think probably I would have walked them through more analysis in class to make sure that they were secure. But again, the same sort of final week where they workshopped drafts and revised their final analysis essay. Their favorite module by any stretch of the imagination was actually the last one, which I always think is interesting because usually by the end of the semester, everybody is dragging and that's hard to do. But they really enjoyed the narrative. We read different types. I wanted to expose them to a bunch. So we did poems and essays. We covered the forbidden. They didn't have any problem with the black and white of Living Doll. We also looked at both the story and short film Danger Word, so we could talk some about adaptation. I wanted them to read The Monkey's Paw because it's the name of Jordan Peele's company, so I wanted them to get that reference. And we read Blood Child. What resonated the most with them, though, were the articles about sort of the real life horror, which I know is something that came up in earlier panels. And really, I have to credit Nurse and Cleo for the first one, Ghosts Are Scary, Disabled People or Not, because it really shifted my thinking about how to teach this in class. And for the students, these were the ones that resonated the most with them so far as discussions and their end of semester reflections. And their product at the end was to write their own horror narrative. So I got poems and I got stories and I got all kinds of different things. So that was a lot of fun. Our wrap up for the class was to revisit the horror tropes we had introduced at the beginning of class. And we watched Cabin in the Woods as a way to talk about the way that tropes were revised or redone. And it just made a really nice wrap up for the semester. So the QR code will actually take you to a folder full of materials for this class. And what I do for my classes is that I create a Google Drive folder for class. And at the end of the week, I scan my lesson plans and my notes and I upload them. Students can upload pictures of board notes. And also my syllabus is a live Google Doc that's hyperlinked with resources and update every week. And for our purposes of our class, our workshop time to work on the end products and to watch the films was all done in class for accessibility. So a couple of sort of the larger takeaways are that doing all the work in class helps most of our students, especially if there are skill gaps, because I can see where they're struggling and help them. But the reality is there are still lots of reasons why in year 4 of a global pandemic, students have to miss class. And that's still something I don't have a great solution for. I was a little surprised at what my students didn't know so far as references in Candyman. And so I would do more front loading about that and perhaps do more current events so they could tie those together. As I mentioned, that last bit about the real life horror articles were the ones that were most impactful. And it was that final conversation that really changed my whole thought on this class, because the students brought up the idea of whose horror it was and who got to tell that story and what horror they thought should be shown or shouldn't be shown at all, actually. And that relates to some of the conversations that we heard earlier on the panels. And this may seem a little ridiculous 11 minutes into a presentation about how to teach this, to have wasted this, but here was my biggest takeaway. I absolutely should not be the one to teach my class. The students loved the fact that they never knew a class could focus on horror. They never knew that they could be at the center of a class, that they loved how it connected to their lives. But as a white professor at an HBCU, I have absolutely no right to be lecturing my students on what horror is for the Black experience and how they should deal with that. My biggest takeaway was that the students love the content, but I just, with my position at the university, that's just not something I should be doing. And so I was not going to teach this class again, except in class this semester, one of my students brought up horror films, or I was talking about my latest article or something. And I said, well, you know, a lot of people look at horror through different lenses. And I said, you know, you can, for example, look at it through a feminist lens. And they suddenly became very interested about that. And I said, well, I theme my classes in the spring about different things. So you want a composition themed about feminist horror, we can do that. And so this semester, as of next week, that's what my revision is. So I've tweaked it a little bit. Module 1, they're going to answer the question of what is feminist horror and sort of walk them through a history of a very brief history, right, of the Gothic and monstrous verse. And then in module 2, we're going to focus on the final girl, and they will choose a scene to analyze about the work the final girl or the movie is doing for that scene. And then in the third one, and this is where I'm carrying over the work from the horror comp, is building on Ashley Blackwell's work with Graveyard Shift Sisters about who gets to be a final girl, and hoping that the students resonate with that. And then ending with, they're going to have to present to the class to make an argument of, can horror be feminist? So I'm still using the module structures, but I'm doing it in such a way as I'm comfortable and I think does not intrude on what I shouldn't teach the students. So the overview is really this, that it's really easy to teach a horror themed comp class because you can focus on the genre elements. You can teach them about format and design and the expectations, revisit things with different expectations, right? So if you do your review on one movie and then you write an analysis on the same movie, that has to be different. And it's also a great way to teach basic skills and having the assignments build together if you have a final assessment you have to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. I think I can see from the chat there, everyone picking up loads of pointers and writing down things that they're going to take from that. So that's wonderful. All right, then, our third speaker for this panel is Geneveive Newman. Geneveive is a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh in film and media studies and English. Her dissertation work focuses on the rape victim survivor as the audience for depictions of rape across mediums, including film, poetry, television, and documentary. She's taught courses in community college, public university, and private university settings in the United States. She's currently serving a 2-year term as a graduate pedagogy mentor for the Film and Media Studies program at the University of Pittsburgh, and is the graduate student representative for the Society of Media and Cultural Studies Horror Scholarly Interest Group. So, go for it.
Thank you. And I know that was a mouthful. I'm also going to kind of hedge a little bit here because I will be repeating things we heard in the first presentation. I guess it's just synergy. But if you find me saying things you're very familiar with, that is perfectly fine. I'm not offended. If you like, go get a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom or something, I get it. So let me share my screen and slideshow. Okay, cool. And it's set up. Everyone can see me.
Perfect.
And we're good. Okay. So sexual violence in the university, trigger warnings, horror screen media, and acknowledging lived experience, right? I want to start with some clarifying terms that may or may not be helpful, but the kind of tension here is between trigger warnings versus content warnings or content notes. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a trigger warning is a statement at the start of a piece of writing, video, etc., alerting the reader or viewer to the fact that it contains potentially distressing material. Then Emily J.M. Knox puts this definition into conversation with content warnings or notes as follows. Quote, trigger warnings are related to and sometimes contrasted with content notes, which are statements that warn the reader that the material might contain information that is of a less traumatic nature, right? End quote. So we come to a question that's more of a trick than a real inquiry to my mind. What level of harm are we expecting the horror media that we ask students to engage with to do, or any media really? Do we think that it's psychologically triggering, or do we think that it will be distressing, but perhaps not rise to the level of clinical, diagnosable autonomic response? The reason that I call this part of the debate around trigger or content warnings a trick is this. It isn't up to us as instructors to assess and essentially guess at each individual student's emotional responses to what we teach. That may sound counter to what I hope that this talk will serve as, which is advocacy for the use of some kind of robust warning system in the classroom. But I want to open with this as a concrete way of getting at the problem I often encounter when this topic arises, especially with people who are on the fence or potentially hostile towards content warnings. The semantic argument is one that has largely overtaken this issue, and I want to stress that at the end of the day, it's not about what we call the warnings on our syllabi. It's about the fact that they're there. Because what a robust warning system of notes, warnings, etc., does is that it puts the power of both engagement and mental health back in the hands of the student, right? So again, detractors will claim, and this is in the Jack Halberstam and then a few of the other pieces that kind of came up around the same time, they'll claim that the advocacy for warnings essentially infantilizes students. But it's important to remember that the warning is not prescriptive, right? It's not a real or an implied demand. It's not saying, so if this is something that's going to bother you, you must do X, Y, Z, right? It's just a way to give additional information akin to including a director, runtime, national context, or language for a film prior to screening it in your syllabus and your kind of preamble, right? So like runtime, for example, it lets your adult students make informed decisions and manage their own affairs with the implicit context on your end that you trust them to do so, right? So it's allowing them, because if you give the runtime and one of your students is dealing with babysitter issues, you are also trusting that student to figure out how to navigate their life, right? Trigger warnings are essentially functioning the same way. So with all of that said, let's get to some of the kind of political stakes of a radical pedagogical praxis as it applies to warnings. Classrooms are unsafe spaces. In doing the research for this presentation, I spent some time going through scholars, Simone Kolish's work, both written and also interviews and podcasts. The one piece that I found the most interesting, that I returned to the most, was an interview that they gave for the Always Already podcast that went live in July 2016 in the US. Roughly 4 months prior to Donald Trump's election to office as president. In this interview, Kolish stresses that classrooms are not, cannot be, in our current context, safe spaces. They always come with the institutional violences of the university, the state, interpersonal conflict, racial and gendered animosities, just to name a few. To add to this, 4 months after the interview's posting, we saw the ramp up in the US of vocal opposition to ideas like critical race theory, gender studies, and others in college and university settings across the country, and obviously in other places as well. This is not to say that this rhetorical and political work had not been long established, but rather that it got louder post-election. Additionally, while school shootings in the US are consistently surpassed or consistently surpassed their own prevalence year to year, the issue has, by 2023, excuse me, reached a fever pitch that I'd be remiss not to mention in a section on unsafe classrooms. So how does this impact our students' classroom experience? How and why should we mitigate harm in the face of an essentially unsafe space? And what do we mean by unsafe? Because I'm kind of pulling on a lot of different meanings for that here, right? So I want us to think about the classroom as kind of a microcosm. And I'm going to give you a little anecdote to lead into this and then get to a broader point later, so bear with me. I also want to say, I recognize that I'm speaking to an international audience here. So I'm going to describe something that may be hauntingly familiar, almost banal, or maybe horrifyingly new. I will also preface with the context that my sister is a high school teacher, so she's in secondary education, which is far more at risk of school shootings than post-secondary in the US. This informs my interaction with the academy as a physical space because I have additional concerns that likely mirror those that my students enter college with, having often just finished high school. So preamble aside, here's what the week before classes every term looks like for me. I'm putting final touches on my syllabus, getting the last few PDFs into our learning management system. I know this sounds familiar. And prepping the physical media that I know that I need for the term. And I'm going to campus to see if I have the ability to barricade my classroom door. I'm finding possible entrances that I might not think to block in a crisis, and all of the ways that I can route 30+ students to safety. I'm double checking my cell phone for emergency numbers, making sure they're written down and labeled in my teaching notebook for a student in case I'm incapacitated. I'm checking windows in case they can open freely, can lock internally, can be reached from the ground. And in recent years, I'm looking for vents and seeing what ventilation looks like, asking colleagues who teach in the same room throughout the day if anyone has an air filter that we can share. I'm going through health and safety steps at the beginning of every term, and it is always, absolutely always insufficient. So how, if I can't trust my classroom to be physically safe before we factor in any other forms of harm and damage, can I expect my students to feel safe? Essentially, the answer is I can't, and we need to start from there and move forward, right? So the other thing to think about here is that we have to include the forms of harm that students encounter on the way to the classroom. These are not vacuum sealed hermetic spaces. So there are things that students walk in the door with that I'm not going to ask them to drop at the threshold, right? My students of color may have been harassed on the way to class by police, campus security, or both. My femme presenting students may have been catcalled on their walk, or they were raped at a frat party last weekend or 3 years ago, but are unpacking it in therapy and actively experiencing flashbacks. As an equally horrifying, but somewhat less loaded example, I had a student walk into my class with a gaping wound on his head from a fight with a roommate that escalated to violence and had happened that morning, right? So the point is that students don't walk in as these kind of blank paper cutouts of people who enter the classroom ready to be filled up with all of our ideas and critical thinking and information. They are actual people with lived experiences that color all of their interactions, including those with their instructors and with their peers. It may be obvious, but I want to kind of state the obvious here and say students are people first, before they're students, before they're workers, before they're anything else, right? And people are subject to violence. We'll return to the statistical probabilities in a minute, but suffice it to say, each student's lived experience most likely includes unimaginable violence. So how do we address this? What are some concrete things we can do around the topic of trigger warnings that will help mitigate these problems in the classroom, or at least control what we have control over, right? So there are innumerable uses for collaborative Google Docs in the classroom as a pedagogical tool. But one that I'm a big fan of is to have students work with you and work together to draft course policies. The students, in collaboration with the instructor, draft a list of topics in this case that they would like a heads up on before a screening, right? Because part of the problem is, well, what do I give a warning for? You don't know who's in your classroom necessarily. We're going to get to that in a minute, but it is a legitimate question to say, but how much do I warn for? Which things do I warn for? We all kind of have a sense, I think, that you should probably warn about rape, but a lot of white professors forget to warn about violence or racial slurs, right? That is something in one of my first classes that I taught independently as instructor of record. I showed The Shining and I gave a lot of content warnings for it, and I forgot to include one for slurs. And it is probably the most shameful moment I've had, and I have made a point of learning from it. So one way to help prevent that from happening is to sit with the students and collaboratively but anonymously work through what they would like a heads up on, and also then to talk about, well, what if you didn't? What if the students themselves didn't include sexual violence? What does that mean about their positionality? What does that mean about their experiences? Because there are multiple reasons that could happen, right? So it also becomes a teaching tool right from the jump. The other thing that it does is it establishes from the first day of class that students are there to engage with each other from a space of care rather than opposition or conflict or competition, right? So they are set up with a sense of communal responsibility to each other and to the learning environment. So Google Docs, I am not paid by them, but I would happily advertise for them. So why does any of this matter? And I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to give you some horrifying statistics. And again, if you need to get up and go get coffee or go to the bathroom, by all means. But the question always comes up when you're talking to people who are, again, on the fence or not on board with giving warnings or any kind of system like that, or drafting course policies as a group, these kinds of things. You run across the question of, well, why should we do this? Why does it matter? Why would we want to include content warnings or notes or anything like that? Why is it important? And who is in our classroom to begin with? Articles and op-eds on why these kinds of warnings are bad, some of which we've already seen, tend to argue that it is a small segment of the student population that has encountered the kind of violence and experiences the kind of distress that might need warnings. So taking sexual violence as an example, because that's the work that I do, and considering just the context of the United States, I'm going to end by laying out some information on who is in our classes, just by the numbers, right? So I do want to give a caveat here. I'm operating in a United States context. The statistics are from the Association of American Universities Campus Climate Survey on sexual assault and misconduct. So that means that we're looking at just 33 colleges and universities in a specific geographical context. These numbers are, however, the most recent and expansive data that I was able to track down, because this survey is from 2019 and it's an update on a 2015 survey, and included almost 182,000 respondents. So given that kind of context, here we go. There. 23 to 49%. So 41,803 to 89,058 college women in their fourth year or later who have experienced completed sexual assault, right? 41%, 74,518 college women in their fourth year or later who've experienced sexual harassment. 6 to 14%, 10,905 to 25,445 college women in their fourth year or later who have experienced intimate partner violence, IPV. 5.8%, 10,542 college women in their fourth year or later who have experienced stalking. This means that tens of thousands, almost 100,000 in some cases, of female students alone who walk into our classrooms across the US have firsthand lived experience of sexual violence, and recently, because this is measuring from the time that they start college, right? And that's just the experiences that we know about. And it's just across 33 institutions. I'm not going to make guesses at the actual numbers. when we extrapolate. But what I do know is that the leading sexual violence survivor and advocacy agencies, both locally and across the US, often, sorry, I lost where I was, consistently note that, oh, I guess my email's on too. Sorry about that. Consistently note that the number of sexual assaults, for example, are significantly higher than we're able to tabulate precisely because our cultural context is openly hostile to reports of sexual and gendered violence. So, one final number to leave you with. 46.8% of respondents to this 2019 survey were referred to counseling services. This means that the vast majority of institutional figures to whom students confide are turning them towards mental health care. I'm really almost done. I've got like 2 sentences. Mental health care. This kind of care requires extreme amounts of personal work. And part of that is about setting boundaries and being able to make decisions based on the individual's place in their healing and as to what they are and are not yet ready to tackle, right? So while many of us will recommend, statistically, will recommend or even personally walk students to counseling resources, by not putting content notes, trigger warnings, or any other kind of information like this on our syllabi and in our course design, so warning about things in the moment before you screen them, we're actively undermining this healing process. So my final thought for you is, please, if you don't already use these tools, if you don't already do this, no shame, but please start, right? Okay, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, really insightful, and I think hits home with a lot of people. Okay, right, our final speaker for this panel is Daniel. Are you with us, Daniel? Have you arrived?
Hi, I've arrived.
You've arrived. Excellent. Right, I'll just introduce you then. So Daniel Tilsley is a third-year PhD candidate in film studies at the University of East Anglia. He is interested in the relationship between philosophy and popular horror films from a cultural studies angle. His research focuses on American horror films of the 50s and 60s and their mediations on contemporary existential thought. He has published on the cult films of William Castle and Phil Tucker, with a recent article on Robot Monster. He also teaches on the history of Hollywood at UEA, and has an interest in supporting disadvantaged children in secondary education. There you go.
So that's something I've actually just come from. So I wanted to second what's been said about the trigger warnings, having just come from my annual safeguarding meeting at my college job, where we, especially given the inherent content of a lot of horror, and I hope to show as in philosophy, the colonialism and the toxic masculinity of it, it's very evident we do need to be warning students. So I've literally had a conversation with a student today about what's actually going on when he's watching his horror films and how it could potentially be not a great idea at this time, but that's just a side point. So thank you for those talks. They were really helpful for me. So a lot of what I'm about to say comes from my recent experiences teaching on philosophy and film courses, both at university and now in further education. So let me just get my thing up. There we go. Is this going to share? Well, can we all see that? Is that okay?
Brilliant. Yep.
Cool. Oh, is it going to work? Come on. I'm pushing the button, but it's not. There we go. I'll just do this. So the considerable number of accessible books about philosophy of and philosophy and certain films is often testament to the popularity of the philosophy of film as a topic in both further and higher education. However, the philosophy of film is often criticized by a number of scholars. And is this PowerPoint actually working? I don't think it's properly. There we go. Right, that's better. So the philosophy of film is often criticized by a number of scholars and educators who doubt whether philosophical readings of films can produce anything of insight when it comes to analyzing the meanings of a film, often complaining that philosophical interpretations are grafted onto a passive film text. Much like how episodes of The Simpsons used to be used in GCSE and A-level philosophy classrooms to illustrate philosophical ideas, films are often presented more so as useful material with which to demonstrate broader philosophical ideas. And while this is often commendable as a means of making philosophical ideas more accessible, it does often seem that the ideas, and these are ideas which often come from the same, usually white men, they come first, whereas the film is only secondary material. In my class experience, this is an attitude shared by many students who will often ask that really disheartening question, well, what's actually the point of this? As said, the point is to introduce these ideas to students, but also to test their analytical skills, to see whether their abilities of philosophical interpretation can be applied more broadly to materials such as film texts. Even so, students often complain about being frequently assigned those great auteur works of genius, like 2001: A Space Odyssey, films from the French and American New Waves, or often obscure art films, as opposed to those more popular or trashy commercial texts that are more immediately relatable, the bread and butter of media industries. Despite numerous philosophy and popular culture volumes released every year, those texts rarely make it onto film and philosophy modules, cementing this idea of academic philosophy as essentially an ivory tower. Moreover, these classes often avoid discussion of the context of the film itself, which have a significant impact on meaning, those contexts of production, reception, as well as wider socio-historical contexts, which again are far more immediately relatable to the student. The emphasis is instead on interpretation, again showing how films can illustrate universal and abstract philosophical problems with little real reference to those mediating contextual factors. And this seems to me a big missed opportunity, particularly in regard to horror films. Indeed, aside from a few key texts, so Noel Carroll's Philosophy and Horror, for instance, horror and science fiction films are relatively under-discussed in scholarly literature in this area specifically, despite their key historic associations with philosophical ideas and material discourses. For instance, horror films were celebrated by post-war French existentialists and surrealists. Philosophers from Nietzsche to Marx frequently made their points through images and ideas tied to the horror genre. Even Hannah Arendt used images of little green men to make her points, and considering she was writing in the 50s, that's quite interesting. The symbols and icons of horror have been wedded to philosophy for a long time, so why aren't we as often discussing the relationship between them in the classroom? In my classes, I draw upon cultural studies approaches, teaching films within their socio-historical context and considering the context of production and reception, which mediated film meanings for audiences, relating film and their reception to the context of the contemporary philosophical discourses, seeing philosophical ideas as Marx did, not as abstract comments, but as products interwoven with the material activity and material intercourse of people. And this can allow the student to offer fresh insights into the philosophy of a film. That is, how films mediate on philosophical discourses present within their contexts. So I teach texts in context to present the film as a participant in philosophical discourse rather than as secondary material to be philosophized with. And in my teaching, given that everyone loves horror, I often use case studies from my PhD research into the lowbrow horror films of the 50s and 60s and their associations with existentialist philosophy. Films like Roger Corman's X, I should have shown that slide earlier, I apologize. Films like Roger Corman's X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, to demonstrate horror cinema's participation in philosophical debates. And I just go back to that one now, there we go. Existential philosophy flooded the cultural field of post-war America, according to historian Louis Menand. Questions on alienation, anxiety, and absurdity were diffused throughout American culture, from sociology to psychology, from literature to drama, from the civil rights movement to the pages of Playboy. Existentialist works were translated into English paperbacks for the first time, fueling the pervasive mood of alienation, estrangement, and rebellion among the affluent post-war generation, post-war student and teenage generation, which emerged at this time. This group was very keen to signal their existential angst, so products were increasingly designed to appeal to it. A market was created for consumer items which appealed to their sense of existential angst, and young people were increasingly signaling their lifestyle through buying choices. lowbrow horror films were directly targeted at this group, often featuring outsider protagonists struggling with alienation and psychological malaise. Existential questions were as much a part of the new consumer culture of the 50s and 60s as it was intellectual debate. Moreover, many key horror creatives were actively engaged in philosophical conversations and trends. Roger Corman, seen here, the director, described himself as a major existentialist in his autobiography, having frequented the same Parisian left bank cafes in the 50s as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, discussing existentialism, which he said was all rage. He also acknowledged that his films were being read as an existentialist, and I quote, "A lot of people ask me if I knew I was being existential. No, I was primarily aware that I was in trouble." Corman knew that in the new system of independent cinema, where audiences were no longer guaranteed and needed to be created, he needed to attract audiences by playing into these broader trends. Corman was also aware that the predominant audience of horror films were teenagers and students, and by the 60s, in response to growing demand and new social movements, colleges were offering first-year courses in existentialism, which often fueled their participation in the new left movements and civil rights movements. According to George Kotkin, hardly a student in the 1960s could be seen without a dogged copy of Walter Kaufman's existentialism anthology. As well as this, campus film societies blew up by 1960. They would often screen imported art films alongside lowbrow horror. Much like existentialism, art cinema was seen as lowbrow and sleazy in the 60s. The cheap aesthetic and surreal quality of Corman's films was not ineptitude, but a deliberate attempt to resemble art cinema, especially Ingmar Bergman's existentialist film, The Seventh Seal, which I showed a picture of earlier. Featuring characters undergoing a psychological crisis in the face of an increasingly absurd and meaningless universe. Recall that this is the 60s, a site of massive cultural upheaval. The film X was also written by horror author Ray Russell, the fiction editor for Playboy magazine, which was also targeted at these same groups. Playboy was strongly associated with existential ideas of alienation in mass society and individual male rebellion, ideas which were also mediated in the fiction section, which platformed figures like Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont, which often led to their Twilight Zone gigs, and in Russell's own work itself, such as Mr. Sardonicus. X features a man initially liberated and able to see through the artificial symbols of mass society, which Playboy often criticized. However, the burden and aloneness of this freedom prompts his alienation from the world and others. And on a side note, horror is often bound up with toxic masculinity, as is philosophy, so it all kind of triangulates into this one space. X's narrative, I argue, can be related to these contexts as a mediation on the existential questions diffused throughout the reception context of youth culture. The film develops a typical existentialist scenario. A man is confronted with the absolute meaningless of the world around him, a realization that ends in his psychological undoing. In the film, Dr. Xavier, played by Ray Milland, plays an alienated outsider who develops a serum which allows him to gain X-ray vision, eventually seeing to the center of the universe itself and the so-called all-seeing eye of God. This sight and realization that all human meaning is arbitrary and the existential feeling of total insignificance forces him to tear out his eyes in horror. Xavier's aim to challenge God ends up in the confirmation that he is, and I quote, "just a man, this and nothing more," which is an essentially existentialist claim. Given the prominence of Albert Camus, the absurdist existentialist author in 60s youth culture, it should be perhaps unsurprising that X strays so close to this philosophy of absurdism. The idea that the world is without essential meaning, that we clothe it, according to Camus, with symbols which may at this very moment lose the illusory meaning with which we have clothed it. For a second, we cease to understand the world, because for centuries we have understood it solely in the images and signs that we have attributed to it. In the film, Xavier is often walking around unable to see the world as it is constructed. He sees right through it, as you can see in some of these images. When looking upon the city around him in the top image, he describes this city in quite absurdist terms, as if it were unborn, rising into the sky with fingers of metal, limbs without support, girders without stone, signs without signs hanging without support, a city unborn, its flesh dissolved in an acid of light. Pullman himself was open about how his use of cheap effects and sets and language such as this was intended to represent the artificial, subjective construction of the world. Like the other absurd dramas of this period, which were also popular, such as the work of Pinter, Beckett, and Ionescu, X revels self-consciously in a low-budget surrealist aesthetic and uses surrealist imagery to convey the popular topic of the absurdity of human existence felt by so many of his audiences. So seen in context, films like X were essentially doing the same things and mediating on the same questions as those more highbrow or so-called legitimate forms of philosophical art or discourse. And this not just in the films themselves where this is happening, this is the explicit part of the mediation of the film as product itself. So if you look at the tagline for X, it says he stripped souls as bare as bodies. Existentialists often presented the human subject as stripped bare or naked before the inexorable march of death or the absurd hostility of the universe. Horror films in this period are deliberately courting trendy philosophical trends, and the taste-making press is encouraging such a reading. Variety wrote of X's philosophical aspects and ideas, while the respectable middle-brow New York Times called it thoughtful. This is quite high praise for films which were essentially lowbrow trash as far as they saw it. So given that we know that existential ideas were circulating in teenage and student culture, and that producers were chasing trends to reverse the decline in audiences, an existentialist reading of X becomes more meaningful. It contributes more to our understanding of the potential meanings of the text in the original moments of reception. It allows students to see a horror film that is actually participating in and drawing meaning from contemporary existentialist discourses. So going back to actually teaching this, I found that such cases have had a positive impact on how students engage with the philosophy of film as a topic itself. In the master's module I taught this year, students described a feeling of liberation, of being able to actually make a philosophical interpretation of a text that did not feel arbitrary or grafted on, but one that was actually made possible by the text itself and by the conditions surrounding the text that mediated its meaning. To paraphrase Peter Barry, such an approach which draws on cultural studies gives the student the feeling that new territory is being entered. So I teach film, the philosophy of film, and particularly the philosophy of horror film, more as a relationship between a text and the context of philosophical debates, which allows students to see how films actually are discussing philosophical issues at the time. They're not these abstract ephemeral concepts, but actually present within culture and society itself. And this also shows how film could be more meaningful for those who consumed it, as opposed to being passive material upon which an interpretation is cast. And as I hopefully have indicated today, horror films provide very rich and fruitful area where such investigations can begin. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Dan. That was really cool.
I hope it was.
It was. I was sat here listening. I was like, oh Christ, what time is it? But it's all good. I was sucked right in there. Okay, so can I ask all four panelists to fling their cameras back on? And we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if people want to sling questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand on the raise hand button, then do so. I will, as always, abuse my position as a panel chair to ask the first question. And it's a question to everybody, really, because in this panel, I feel like there's been a lot of sort of unpacking and dancing around the concept of content and trigger and what's warned against and what's not. And particularly in Genevieve's paper, with students coming into the classroom with potentially a whole, library of their own personal traumas. And this might be a devil's advocate question a little bit. When we give trigger warnings / content warnings, are they more to protect us rather than the students? What do you think? Anyone? Yeah, Genevieve, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think both. Mm-hmm. and partially because I'm going to intentionally misinterpret your question. Walking into a classroom as an instructor, you are also a person who also has their own trauma. And I think that it is often overlooked that instructors are often disabled, and I consider mental illness and PTSD a disability, right? So in part, it is to establish ground rules, right, for your students to say, we're going to care about this and we're going to protect each other. And whether you say it or not, that's also, we're going to protect me and you, right? It's mutual. I'm a big fan of the classroom space as mutually constitutive, right? I'm not, like, I lecture occasionally, but I don't love I'm just throwing knowledge at them. So I think it goes both ways. And I think that that's intentional. And I think that that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I agree. Anyone else want to chip in on that? Or we do have someone with their hand up?
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with that as well. I mean, I think it's got to be for both. I don't like the idea of the sage on the stage, or the sort of, it's got to be a space that is kind of established by ongoing negotiation almost. That sounds dry, but you know, this classroom's got to work for my students, but I've got to feel like as an individual myself, it's got to work for all of us, of course. And mutual respect and sensitivity.
And I'd just add, I mean, teaching at an HBCU where the majority of my classes are all Black students, just hearing from them their experience that they've gone through their entire educational careers where they're never given a trigger warning, right? They're taught about enslavement. And because we're in rural North Carolina, there are plantations everywhere, right, that are not called enslaved labor camps like they should be, right? And so it's interesting too, when we have conversations about trigger warnings, and I used to teach high school here in the States, is that it's interesting too what we, and we's doing a lot of work there, but what we do not consider trigger warnings for, and a lot of it is our entire history, right? Colonialism and everything else. That I think the fact that we have conversations about what we should be considering our students, and that's what I loved with Geneveive was looking at those statistics, right? That I think that's really helpful to look up, not just generally for whatever country you're in, but your region and your school, to see what the lived reality of your students is.
Absolutely.
As I said, like in my thing, literally had to deal with this today. So it's like, we definitely do need this to be a conversation that's being had. Like it's their safety, it's our safety. And it avoids so many minefields if you just take that basic few seconds to warn them,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we'd have someone with their hand up. Karrȧ, I hope I'm saying that right. I apologize if not.
Hiya. Yeah, you said it right. It's okay. Thank you everyone for great presentations. I really enjoyed them. And I have a question. I don't know if it's a good one, but I was thinking about how to deal with cultural shifts during teaching. Like, for example, few years back, I had a module about BAFTSS studies, and just as we were ending, there was this scandal about Joss Whedon and his misogynistic behavior, and I was kind of sad that we didn't have time to address that. And my colleague, just last year, she had a module about Russian television, and 2 weeks later, Russia invaded Ukraine. So how can we deal with something that happens while we are already having established syllabus, and we have something, some kind of schedule that we are going to use? So how do we deal with this?
I mean, Stella, I'll open that. One of the things that I really like, and Geneveive talked about this too, about Google Docs, I'm also a big fan of Google Docs, is that my syllabus is a live hyperlinked Google Doc. So one of the ways that I deal with that is I just change what we're doing. But one of the things that I also do in my classes is I am very specific about who we cite and why. And that goes so far as who I cite in my syllabus, right? The movies we watch and why they're problematic or not. I will not cite people scholarly that have been accused of rape. I won't cite people that still use the phrase Anglo-Saxon because I'm a medievalist by training, right? Like, I just won't cite those people, but I tell the students I won't cite them. We talk about making sure that who you cite on your syllabus is not the first search result that comes up, right? You should have at least half of the people you cite in your works cited should be female, right? That you should, if you're writing about queer issues, you need to be citing queer scholars. If you're writing about Black horror, then you need to cite Black scholars. And so I think part of that comes with how you model, which is something that Ivan and Geneveive and Dan all, talked about too in their presentations about using our classes for models. But I think it's really important to be explicit about, I chose this person, I did not choose this, and here's why. And I think Karrȧ especially, offers that up. I will never, ever teach about, and I will never write about Jeepers Creepers, because I'm not going to teach a rapist, right? And it's part of our professional responsibility, I think, to be aware of those conversations, but also to bring them into our classrooms.
Amazing answer. Ivan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm gonna just, I agree with what Karrȧ said, really, but to me, we have to, we owe our students, if nothing else, we owe them sensitivity to them as individuals, and we need to model the critical alertness and sensitivity that we would expect them to develop, if pedagogy means anything. So for instance, to talk about the specific examples, Buffy, currently rewatching it with our 17-year-old, our 19-year-old daughter is a big fan, so she's been keen to encourage a 17-year-old to watch it. And it's really interesting watching it with a different generation. Of course, what they're picking up on is how dated a lot of it is and how some of it hasn't aged very well in terms of, we watched Teacher's Pet last night, and there's a whole lot of discussions after we watched it about, how appropriate it is to even have these representations of, an adult teacher and a 16-year-old supposedly boys sort of involved and so on. So yeah, I think we have to be sensitive to that and reflect it. It doesn't invalidate the text for me as one to discuss, because a lot of the students are bringing Buffy with them. They want to talk about it. So I'm not going to tell them that because Joss Whedon's been revealed as less than a savoury character, that the text is unsavoury. But in terms of Ukraine and Russia, well, I've been showing the Odessa steppe sequence from Battleship Potemkin for as long as I can remember, but it's a very different scene to show these days. You have to teach it differently. You have to show it differently if you're going to show it at all. One of my favourite novels is Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. I like to refer to that, and I like to get students to look at it. But Bulgakov is a problematic figure in certainly in Ukrainian terms at the moment. So yeah, you have to be alert to the fact that these texts shift with the world around us, and that's important.
Any other questions from other folks? Oh, people with hands up. Ashley, you've got your hand up.
Hi, so I just had a question about thinking back to Genevieve's comment as well, that like we as instructors have things that we've experienced in our in our own lives too that could be considered traumatic. I hear I've heard a lot amongst all the papers. Thank you everyone for your papers and for sharing a lot about being very attuned and mindful of the sensitivities or vulnerabilities students might have. But thinking about my own experience as someone who's experienced, I guess, a lot of medical trauma as a part of, I've had a chronic illness from the time I was 5. So a 30-year history with that. It's part of the reason I love horror and find it super therapeutic. But there's lots of things I guess I could code as being like traumatic that's happened in my life. But I'm also wondering, where's this space for like demonstrating like strength and resilience too, because one of the things I find myself grappling with a lot in my waffling back and forth with like content warnings, trigger warnings, whatever, whatever we might want to call them, is I don't want to like prime students to be, if I'm thinking about my own role as a student. I went to school when I was not given like content warnings. And if someone told me, there's medicalizing, like trauma in this, I think that would have put me in a weird headspace in which to view it, and almost like primed me to have an adverse reaction to it in a way that I don't know that I would have. And I'm also occupying this weird space as a biracial scholar too, where it's like, how do I occupy, things about, representations of slavery and Blackface when I'm coming from like two different backgrounds and stuff. And I myself kind of take up the idea that I want to get real with my students and share kind of like my own vulnerabilities, but empower them to believe like you can survive, anything, and like a piece of media is not necessarily going to hurt you. But I'm just wondering, like for each of you, where's that negotiation between like also modeling like resiliency and modeling like strength, and rather than like ongoing like just a sense of that kind of fear brain space of like guarding and protecting ourselves, because I feel like recovery is an important part as well of like recognizing one's own empowerment. So I'm just curious if anyone could speak to that.
That's a great question, Ashley. And the thing I use in all my classes for teaching is the idea of grace and space, right? So if you're not in a place where you can watch or talk about a rape scene, or and I'm thinking too of films like Last House on the Left specifically, that sort of totally focus on brutalizing women, and it's one of the things I'll talk about this spring with my feminist horror, right? Like how do we as women deal with the fact that I love writing about horror, and yet it is an industry where male creators make money brutalizing women for a living? Right, like how do we sort of do that, but also make the space in class? For me, a lot of this comes up with the on the fly discussions, right? Like, what do the students have to say, and just creating the space where they feel comfortable saying, I'm not comfortable with that, or I couldn't look at that, or I had to walk out for that, but also creating the space where we can talk through it. And I don't think you can. I always sort of think of classes and policies and content warnings as providing the framework for the class, but then there's what the class culture looks like with those particular students, and what those reactions are. And so that's generally what it ends up looking like in my class, which I know is not a specific answer, but I don't think these are magic ball sort of questions.
Yeah, there is no one right answer, but that was a great perspective and I appreciate it.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes left before we're going to wrap up, so that we do get a 10-minute break before the next panel. So Genevieve, I can see still got your hand up. You're burning to answer this question, so I will leave it over to you to make the last point.
Yeah, just on this kind of question, I find that one of the biggest, most powerful tools I have in the classroom is to be vulnerable with my students. This does not mean that I fully disclose that I am a sexual violence survivor to my students in my classroom, but it means that I bring in the research I'm doing for my dissertation on sexual violence. And I specifically in the dissertation talk about the multiplicity of the kind of experience of being a victim and a survivor, right? Sometimes simultaneously, sometimes one or the other. So I think it comes down to from a philosophical level in the classroom, the first concept is always people are not simple, right? It's the Avery Gordon complex personhood, right? So if you start from there and you weave that throughout, then it undergirds the idea that the content warning on the film for that week or given right before is a tool for them rather than a suggestion, right? It gives them the information, but doesn't load it with other things. The other thing I wanted to say to an earlier question is really controversial. I don't teach Hitchcock. I don't teach Polanski. I refuse. So it's in a horror classroom, it's always iffy to say that, but I will not teach psycho. I will not teach vertigo in an intro to film class. So if anyone needs to feel empowered to also make that decision, I wanted to put it out there for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, that's going to be the end of this panel. Thank you all so much for your incredible papers and the chat afterwards. I think we've raised an awful lot of important questions that we could all yak on about for the next several hours, but I think we do need a break.